I'm excited to be joined today by Sean Mackay, Senior Staff Engineer at Fresh Consulting. Sean's going to share how we can leverage AI in a way that yields tangible, positive results. So I'm very much looking forward to the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Sean.
Thank you for coming. And my hope is that this presentation will be very useful to you, but very information dense. We are going to share the slides. So if I don't cover it, you will still be able to come back and refer to it. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to share this insights deck, which is it allows us to bundle things with our slide deck. So you can get some additional things like this AI readiness checklist, as well as generative AI privacy tools terms. So this is where I'll be talking about IP indemnity and data protection. So like these kinds of things will be bundled with the link we're going to be sharing. So with that said, I will enter full screen. We are going to do a high level. We're going to talk about definitions first. And the primary reason that I like to talk about definitions is because there's a lot of marketing terminology versus what I would consider more technical terminology. And so I would rather talk about it from a technical perspective, since that's the way that I will work with it. Risks. This is in order to have a successful AI, ML, LLM project, you're going to need to deal with a number of risks. And so we're going to identify some very common ones so that you can have them on your radar for a successful implementation. And then opportunities. This is where I'm hoping it'll get your juices flowing, where you're going, okay, I could use AI here, I could use an ML solution here, and you can see where it can apply to your organization. And then some recommendations. These are things that we have seen or that research has indicated or that are best practices that we believe will also help improve the likelihood of a successful AI project. And of course, at the end, we'll be doing a Q&A. Please hold all questions to the end. Thank you. So why would you even be interested in this? So why is this an important topic? If you wanted to do the bandwagon question, at least 28% of manufacturing companies in the US and 50% in Europe are working on AI solutions. The primary focus that they have is on maintenance and quality. There are a number of other applications that you can do besides those two, and we'll cover that. Another reason to consider AI is if you look at the manufacturing industry, it generates approximately 1.8 petabytes of data annually. And this is much more than numerous other very large industries. And this is where AI will become very valuable, because if you need to process lots of data and you need to do it in a semi-intelligent or intelligent way, the AI solutions we're going to talk about will be very useful for that. However, it's not all happiness. 91% of AI projects in manufacturing have not met expectations. And down here, we can see 27% of companies are seeing current value from their AI projects. So the goal of this presentation will hopefully help you to be in that 9% that did have something that met expectations, and in that 27% that are getting value from an AI project. So for definitions, what is AI? This is a definition that I really like. AI is a computer system able to perform tasks that ordinarily requires human intelligence. So underneath it, like how it's implemented, there's a lot of flexibility. You can use machine learning, you can use deep learning, and you can do things like boring things like rules. So rules engines and expert systems, for example, are artificial intelligence that does not fall under the neural networks or the transformers or the LLMs. Machine learning is something where you create programs that can learn what to do rather than explicitly be programmed to do those things. So when you have all of this data that you've collected, you can then use that data to train a machine learning model, and that model will then be able to do something in a very targeted way. And it's always important to remember that with machine learning and also with AI, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And so the way to think about that is the Mendeleev's periodic table from the 1800s. He came up with this periodic table, and it was not complete, as you can see with the gaps. But what he was able to do was he was able to predict missing elements, what their properties would be, what their color would be. And so it was a useful model, even though it was wrong. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that you will have some degree of wrongness, and then how do you work with it? And that's what you need to have some flexibility with. Machine learning and AI, when they overlap, you get neural networks. And so then you can get deep neural networks, which really came into the scene in 2012. You started getting amazing improvements in image processing. You started seeing the AIs defeating Go players, which before was considered impossible. And so with the advent of large neural networks, you were able to get some really impressive feats. In 2017, the transformer architecture came along for a neural network, and that's what LLMs or ChatGPT or OpenAI or Anthropic's AI systems are built on. However, you're not going to be dealing with things like rules-based engines and expert systems when you are dealing with these neural networks. And generally, for sake of convenience, I will refer to AI throughout this presentation. Most often, I will mean both AI and ML. And that's just to avoid saying AI ML. And the reason is that there are some things that machine learning is really good for targeted small solutions or for one-offs. And then if you want some like higher level intelligence to do bigger analytics, that might be where you bring in the AI. Also, for example, in machine learning, you have things like decision trees and linear regression, you have classification systems, and all of those are very specialized tools. Think of this as tools in a toolbox, and you want to figure out which is the right tool for the right problem. And so we will talk about the risks. So generative AI, which is what is a broad term for the things that can generate images, but then can also generate text. All of the chat bots, the chat GPT, those things are all generative AI. One of the known risks is hallucination. So they will just make up things that don't really exist. So there's a famous example of a lawyer who used ChatGPT to come up with legal precedents. I think he got disbarred because it made up a bunch of them and he didn't check his sources. Misinformation, you can get the wrong answer from it, and it's not because of any malice or incompetence. It's just the fundamental underlying implementation. For example, if you ask ChatGPT or GPT-4o how many R's are in strawberry, it will often tell you 2 or 4 instead of 3. And then if you ask it to explain it, it will still come up with this wonderful sounding explanation, but it's very wrong. You need to keep in mind that there are risks when you start using these, that you can't just assume that this is an infallible authority on everything that you're asking. And I should mention that with every single one of these risks, there's ways to mitigate these risks, to reduce them, but it's important to be aware of them. And it's also important, for example, if you talk to a vendor who's trying to sell you some kind of AI solution, make sure that they have figured out how to work around those, because maybe they haven't. Copyright violations, we'll cover that in more detail, but it's very possible to get entire content that's copyrighted as an answer back. And some people have made the mistake of then using that in their own materials without giving credit, and they've been sued for that. Outdated data, this is every LLM, for example, has a point where it's been trained and it is no longer has new information. Now, of course, there's ways around that. For example, with agents, you give them tools and like it can do a web search or it can access some documents. Misinterpretation. So it's possible for the AI to misinterpret what you ask. It's also possible for you to misinterpret what it's giving. And that just has to do with the fact that there's going to be certain guesses made by every single model in terms of like how the creator wanted that model to act. And if you tried to go from one model to another, you might find, for example, that, if you will, the personality is different. And so then what we thought was you could take for granted because you used OpenAI, you can't do for Anthropic. Training data bias. The most famous example of this is Amazon about a decade ago. They were training an AI system for hiring. And they basically used all their previous hiring data. And they found that there was an extreme bias towards hiring only men and not women. And so then they tried stuff like taking out the gender flag from the resumes and anything like that. And it still preferred hiring men over women because there's things like a women's volleyball or a women's college that still seeps through in the resume. And it was enough information for it to correlate and then make its biased decision. So when you're training a system, you want to make sure that you have first analyzed your data properly, because it might be that you might be codifying something you're not intending to. And security exploits, there's a couple interesting ones with this. In the agent world, there's the model context protocol. And it's possible, for example, for there to be some security hole injections by just blindly trusting any model context protocol server. And so this is something that's recently come out in the last month or so. Likewise, there was a person who recently used AI to code I believe it was an CRM, and they were bragging about it. They did it over a weekend. And then 2 days later, the guy was posting asking for help because hackers were relentlessly attacking his system. Another risk to be aware of is the sharing of sensitive data. Source code and regulated data are the top content that's shared. This then opens this information up to anyone that if the network connection is not secure, then someone sniffing on that would be able to get it. But you also run the risk of all of this material being used for training the future LLM models. And so then, just like we were talking about with copyright material, where all of that content could be, if you make the right query, you could get all the content of something copyrighted. You could likewise get all the content of something sensitive that you uploaded. So this is a risk to be aware of. And usually what is occurring is this is under the umbrella of shadow AI, where it's people are sharing information. They're using AI tools without permission. And so then what that does is it exposes your organization to risk that you might be having confidential sensitive information being shared to this third party, and then that can be misused somehow. So it's better to have some kind of AI tool available to your company, to your team, and just keep in mind that the younger generations are much more likely to do this. With respect to how the sensitive data is being shared, usually it's either hooking up their email system or their cloud drive, so like a Google Drive or a Dropbox or something like that, to the AI. And so then it can just parse all the stuff that is in those folders that they've shared. So this is just something to be aware of. You will want to make sure that you have policies regarding that. I mentioned IP indemnity earlier. So this is a real life example. Someone performed a search on Perplexity, then it exposed some copyrighted material from Wall Street Journal. A staff and basically made the blog post for the staff member. The staff member published the original content, published it as original content, and then they got a legal claim from the Wall Street Journal. So if you do not have IP indemnity, you're at risk with all of these things. So it's important when you're thinking about AI that you think about indemnity as well. So now with the slightly scary stuff out of the way, we'll talk about opportunities. When you're just getting into AI, it's best to ease your way in, do things that are small first, things that can like just assist. And then you can work on things like recommender systems or stuff that is attached to your documentation that can give advice. Then you can work on automation to the extent that you really wish to fully invest in this. You don't have to go this path. It might be that your only primary value is autonomous systems, but you will find that it's harder to just jump into that. It's easier to get your foot wet and then to work into the waters. Here we have generative AI tech infrastructure. So what we're looking at here is all the different layers that you can see in your technology stack. So you might be gathering the information down here, and then you have it being organized, controlled, and then you have the transactional layer with an ERP system, and then you have a data layer where you're starting to go, okay, I have all of this data, I'm storing it, I'm needing to process it, I'm needing to make reports. You want to make models or analyze, and then you'll have some kind of user interface. One of the things I want to mention, and this is often forgotten about with machine learning or AI, is there's a whole little division of machine learning called tiny ML, which works on really small devices. And so you can use these. Let's say, for example, you have sensors that are checking temperature, and you don't really want all the information when the temperature is within a certain range because it's like the normal range. But you want, as it's approaching the edges of that range, you want to start getting that information so that you can make intelligent changes. That's where something like tiny ML would be useful. Likewise, if you needed to like sort a bunch of nuts where you want octagonal versus circular versus square, you might be able to just use a tiny ML with some image processing, and it can do that, and it can still be on a very small device with using very little power. And the reason I mention that is most everyone talks about the big stuff, the LLMs, the generative AI, but there are intelligent solutions you can apply even at the low levels. And then also, one thing to keep in mind is when you're thinking about computing, most things will be in-house when you're talking about this lower level, and most often you'll be dealing with cloud solutions. However, that is not a requirement. You could, for example, even host your LLMs on your own server and have a really powerful server. It'll need to be a decent server, but you can host an LLM that will be decently powered. And you wouldn't need to then pay subscription fees to outside organizations, et cetera. That's actually something that's possible now. Also, when you're thinking about cybersecurity, AI has a lot of value here. Intrusion detection, firewalls, risk analysis. It can parse supergiant logs and make intelligent assessments out of multi-hundred megabyte security logs, for example. And so here's a number of use cases. We're going to just be covering a few. Product design and development. There's a lot of things where you can use AI to improve the speed of your product designers and the development team, and you can have it work against constraints. There's all kinds of algorithms that can be used. For example, I'll show in a later slide something that is used for modeling the facilities, and it uses an optimization algorithm such as a particle swarm optimization. You also have for supply chain and logistics, you can have things that are monitoring your inventories, making sure that you do not run out of things, anticipating inventory needs. And even if you have good connections with your suppliers in terms of APIs, you might even be able to anticipate when they're going to have a problem providing you with what you need. And of course, everyone talks about predictive maintenance. This is something that is 5 years ago, I think it was a very immature technology, and it's really become more mature. You can anticipate failures of hardware. If you have the sensor information, that can either allow you to order some replacement parts in advance and then replace it right when it fails, or fix it right when it fails. Or you can just use this to assign tasks to your maintenance team and say, okay, we're anticipating this, go ahead and change the stuff out. G-code creation for CNCs and 3D printers. So I just recently stumbled on a project that's an open source project where you can give an image to this. So show it an image and it will generate the G-code for 3D printing that image. So just fun advancements in the G-code creation arena. Customer interaction and support solutions. This is predominantly where most people will have seen AI implemented at businesses. It used to be that even a couple of years ago, it was only 30% of companies used an AI chatbot. Now it's 80% of companies use an AI chatbot for tier 1 tech support. And then you can increase team proficiency or efficiency with training and performance and talent management. These kinds of things, you can develop training programs using your existing documents, or for example, you can analyze the strengths of your team and then maybe allocate them according to where they perform best. So here's the example of the facility. I'm not going to talk about the text because that's kind of the boring part, but the great thing here is that this is a way to do rapid prototyping, and you can then add features to it, like in the bottom slide, and where they'll say, okay, let's add certain roads, and then you can then see it in that 3D modeling that it was doing. With respect to this technology, it's also, you can think of this as something that can be done for CAD diagrams. And so that, for example, if you have a board that you're trying to design, you can use this to assist with the designing in boards as well. These are a number of ways to help with operations. So you can create product concepts and engineering diagrams to reduce R&D and prototyping time. So that previous slide is a good example of how you can use this sort of thing. You can also, there's a number of scenarios where these big research companies have been using it to find new molecules that can solve certain problems, and they're doing it all virtually. But basically, they're able to narrow down what the scientists and the researchers have to actually look at. So then, instead of 1,000 possibilities, they only have to look at 10. And so then they can evaluate those 10 likely solutions. And that's also being used for all kinds of healthcare stuff too, which is obviously not manufacturing, but it's an example of how this kind of idea is being deployed. You can also automate material reordering, minimize stockouts and inventory levels. And you can also pre-screen, summarize, extract clauses of interest across contracts and assess risks. Actually, you can the way to think about this is that you can use it to analyze a document and give you back actionable insights really quickly. And you don't need any time to implement this. If you have a Google Cloud Drive, Gemini is already built into this. You just load your document into Google Cloud, and then you can ask it all kinds of questions like, what are the key takeaways? What are the risks from this? What are my next steps? And you can do all kinds of things. And if you're dealing with contracts, you can say, what are there any like loopholes I need to be worried about? Or are there any things that seem to be my responsibilities that I wouldn't normally like? And you might take a few rounds because you'll have to talk to the Gemini for it to get context, but you can then do this almost immediately. So this is a great way to get started. And if you're having to deal with regulations and auditing and all that sort of thing, you will know about writing very painful documentation for that, standard operating procedures and policies. It can be very mind-numbing. And you can use AI to help write 80% of it. And then what you do is you just edit it and tailor it according to your particular environment. And that is a great way to save yourself a lot of time as well as boredom. So a case study here, Schaeffler used Microsoft Fabric, integrated it with their facility, and with that, they were able to get AI-ready data state so the employees can access key metrics like scrap rates, yields, energy usage via natural language queries, reducing onboarding and troubleshooting time. So the key thing here is that with this tool, you suddenly had the ability to access insights into the entire facility. And because the natural language queries are available, you can do this intelligently. And there's a lot more things that Schaeffler is doing. For example, they want to be, carbon neutral by 2030, and they're using this approach to help them. I also want to share a client that I worked with about 5 years back, maybe 6 years at this time. And they've been doing some very intelligent use of AI to overcome skill gaps. For example, NOV, and this is a division run by Ash Manon. He's a really great guy. So if you ever run into him, I highly recommend talking to him. He was wanting to get a proof of concept of AI to automate G-code creation. And that was something we did with a simulator called Vericut. And then we trained AI models off of that. So that was using something called reinforcement learning. And that's a subset of all the different kinds of MLs. But don't need to get into that rabbit trail. And then after that, one of the things that we were talking about was training wheels, because one of the problems that he had was staffing his CNC machines. He had lots of CNC machines that could do work, but he didn't have the operators to do it. And so he was like, how can I grab someone off the street, give them some training wheels so that they can learn this without ruining our machines, and we can start having more uptime. And so that is an example of how you can use AI training to offset, for example, skilled labor shortages. And then also his organization and he made a startup called Iridia, which has the idea of using ML to synthesize the information from numerous CNC machines in a facility and present it in such a way that any high schooler would be able to use Iridia and tell a company how to improve efficiencies in the factory. So this is something that's really crazy. Like he hired a barista who manages 4 facilities and can give improvement insights to 4 facilities. And because you don't need to have the training, the ML that he used, plus the AI and the way he designed his interface. All of that is something where it's very easy to use. Anyone with low skills but has good human interaction skills, good customer service skills, can use it and then interact with the clients. And so it's a great source. There's some details here that he shared. He using Iridia, he was able to help a facility that was going to shut down. And they identified so much waste that they were able to become profitable and be profitable enough that they had to add 2 extra shifts. And so that's an awesome success story. And this is also proof that AI doesn't have to ruin people's jobs. It can actually help people have jobs. And also he has a case here where by focusing on invisible lost time, they were able to bring back all kinds of international business into the Navasota, Texas facility. And they became profitable despite deterioration in price as well as volumes. And they were the only division of the company that was profitable at that time. And it was entirely due to identifying waste and removing it. And so Another example here is they unlocked 28,000 hours of machining capacity in a facility in Broussard, Louisiana. So these are examples of you have an intelligent use of AI. And what you don't want to do is just throw AI on anything, and you don't want to just accept anything that has an AI sticker. There's all kinds of fraud going on with that. You want to be very intelligent about how you apply it and discerning, because there's a lot of scammers out there. I think there was a coupon company that was advertising that they were were for expense reports, and they were advertising that they had AI to do it. But behind the scenes, they just had an army of low pay human workers that was the AI. All right, some recommendations. So first off, you want to make sure that if you're using a cloud LLM, that you're getting IP indemnity. So if you notice here, the individual plan does not provide it, but the business plan does. So this is something that's very valuable. Gives you some legal protection. Likewise, also make sure that you pay to have your data excluded from training if you're going to use a cloud LLM, because you don't want your sensitive information being shared with other people, potentially your competitors. So here, what we have is the different kinds of scenarios. You could go, I'm just going to use something like OpenAI solutions, and I'm not really going to do much customization. And this has the primary value that it gets you going really quick. You lose, obviously, on the customizability front. But one of the things to be aware of is that you could really have billing surprises. A company that I had done some consulting work with last year, every time they generated a report for their clients, it cost them $10,000 in LLM expenses. So it's affordable for getting started, and if you can keep things at an even keel, it'll be pretty inexpensive. But if you have surprise large usages of an LLM, you could run into large expenses. Building a custom app, especially with making your own models from scratch, this can be very expensive, and it's generally not common or recommended. Usually there's enough models that you can bootstrap with. Olama, for example, has LLMs that you can host yourself, and then you can keep your training from scratch models to just like the machine learning, which are much easier and cheaper to develop. Let's see what else to highlight here. I think that's everything. The one callback is if you're going to use enterprise plans, they tend to have really good integration with Office. So if you're providing Office documents, that's something where they're going to be much better at parsing it than a custom solution, although that landscape is also changing. So a lot of these things, especially the X's that you see, aside from the billing surprise, those are probably going to decrease with time. Eventually, if you start using AI in lots of different places, you'll start having a very complex system where you'll have some stuff that's from LLM, some stuff that's from like maybe an expert system, something maybe from a rules engine, and you'll need something that orchestrates it. And the orchestrator can then contact each of the systems or third-party APIs, et cetera, get the information that you're requesting, and then send it back. So it's a way to make it so that it's easier and you have less things to worry about for tracking. Fresh implemented its own orchestration system called Brancher One, and it has a number of components that make this orchestration possible. You have single purpose apps that you can make within it. You can also have direct access to GPT just so that you can brainstorm or figure out some higher level analysis without being constrained by apps or agents. Agents are something where you tell the LLM to put on a hat, like you're an expert legal document reviewer. And so then by giving it some instructions, and I want you to find like where there might be risks for me, where there might be some benefits to me, or things that I need to be aware of in this legal document. If you give it enough instructions and you ask for the feedback in a certain way, it will then rule out all kinds of different possible statistical that don't fit the expert legal reviewer mindset. And so it's a way to get information from a chat GPT that's much more intelligent. And in fact, some of the best research for using the GPTs from a few years ago was using this orchestration of, okay, we have a manager agent who gives responsibilities to these researcher agents. And then when they're done, they give their results to an evaluator agent. I'm like, you can get really complicated with this and make a sort of a workflow of your agents, but you then get considerably higher quality results. Also, for example, with images, you can generate images that's a very common use case. And also, if you've seen the recent Google Veo 3 makes it possible to make videos. So you'll be able to do AI videos. Maybe if you want to do training or even just a rough draft for marketing material, that's a good way to get started. And then also researchers. So like one of the things that is obviously a danger with AI is that they can give you all those hallucinations. So a researcher then says, okay, one of the things that I'm required to do is actually have primary sources that I'm referencing to give the answer. So it doesn't make just things up. It actually pulls from the documents itself. And so that's a way to get much more reliable information. And then workflows, like you can, as I was mentioning with the way you can do that with agents, you can start building up different ways to automate processes. And so this is just little screenshots of what that looks like in Brancher 1. So here's image creation and workflows. The rest of it's just like text, so it's harder to see. And so then some best practices I want to cover. And in particular, there's 3 I want to call out. Form a centralized team to coordinate generative AI efforts across the organization. It's really tempting to just have this team that's disconnected from everyone else, making all these decisions for generative AI solutions and how it's going to roll out. And that's going to create a lot of friction in the other departments. They're not going to be prepared for anything that you're going to decree from on high with a centralized team. But if they have representatives, the representatives can also work with their own organizations, get feedback, improve the process, and your chances of success are greatly improved. Likewise, you can use generative AI tools for facilitating audits, bias checks, risk assessments. These kinds of things are very good. You can give it like an entire slew of documents and then say, what's the pattern here from a risk perspective? And then you can even go into details of the kind of risks that you're looking at. And it will then be able to, with that constraint, give you good answers. Also, you'll want to establish clear processes for ongoing improvements of model outputs. Let's say, for example, that you had an AI solution or an ML solution that was focused on shipping and handling all those logistics that way. And suddenly there's a need for handling tariffs. And that wasn't part of the original training. You want to have some processes that clearly delineate when you want to update your models to handle new kinds of constraints or data. And this is just an example of comparison of lots of different costs for using various LLMs. And you can see that for 750,000 words, the price is really inexpensive. And if you started $18, that's not going to be much. And if you just have small needs that are just here and there, that's actually a good way to go. If you have complicated needs, you're more likely to get good answers from the ones that are more expensive. Gemini 2.5 is excellent. Anthropics are excellent. But they're also more expensive. If you look at this one here, where an old Gemini version is $6. If you have a bunch of simple queries, it's very likely that Gemini that's $6 is going to be a better value for you, because you can offload 90% of your LLM queries to this cheap model and then do 10% against the more expensive. And so then you're almost saving 2/3 of the cost. This particular slide is just to highlight that it's a very easy tendency to focus on AI solutions that actually will decrease value for your employees and staff. If they like doing certain parts of the work and AI is brought in to take that work away, then you're actually going to get morale problems. And usually the stuff that they like working on is things that are more challenging or things that require their thinking or their creativity. And you want to allow the people to do that and then hopefully use AIs for repetitive tasks and that sort of thing. So with that in mind, that's why, for example, you can see you might get morale improvements with certain changes or applying of AI, but there might be cases where it actually hurts morale, because if you're not taking into account what your staff actually is good at and enjoys doing, like what they consider themselves the craftsmen or craftswomen at, you might really hurt morale. And so that's just something to be aware of. As you can see, there's productivity improvements in general just from AI solutions. Now, that doesn't mean that they're large productivity improvements. It might be something like 5%, or it might be something, but if you get 5% across multiple employees, that might be worth it. So sometimes you also want to worry about your ROI. Am I going to get enough improvement from this? Also, with respect to training impact, AI, like predictive maintenance, that's not really going to change what your maintenance staff is going to have to do. It's just going to give them a task list. So that's not going to adjust any training needs. Likewise, if you're doing customer support, there are going to be things that the AI is not going to be able to handle properly that needs to be escalated. So you're still going to have customer interaction support training. So some final considerations. It's important to know your business constraint requirements and constraints. Confirm the solution or software meets those requirements with at least a freeform demo. And by that, I mean go off the prescribed path that the person that's demoing the software wants to take you on. So you want to make sure that if you go click over here, it doesn't say some kind of exception or not yet implemented or something like that. You want it to actually be able to do all the things that you want to use. So that's a good, just general rule of thumb. Always make sure that's something at the initial starts of the evaluation of a product. Also, when you are at the point of where you're looking at deployment, always build into your contract some kind of pre-evaluation period. In the software industry, we call that user acceptance testing. But basically, you want to be able to gate whether or not this gets deployed, or the vendor has to go back and redo the work before you pay. So you don't want to be obligated to pay something when it's not really acceptable for your organization. Also, something to keep in mind is that generally, if you haven't really thought through your requirements, in software, for example, the average software project requirements change 30%. And so that's a really big cost in rework. And so if you can be really good about your requirements up front, it minimizes surprise costs. Also, it's important to prefer incremental changes for faster ROI. Now, consider you're making this large AI solution, and it's actually any software solution too, and then you're going to deploy it to your whole organization. You have many departments affected. So you might deploy it in June 1st, but all the training for the staff and the making of new processes, et cetera, it might take till June or September 1st for that to actually be used. So what you want to do is you want to do things smaller where the delay might be a week. Okay, we're deploying this. Okay, we have to do one new process, and it's actually an existing process that we just have to tweak. And then if you keep things smaller, it'll get the adoption much higher and much more successful. Also, focus on highly repetitive tasks because those are very good ways to get incremental improvements and also provide high value, as well as reduce your risks as an organization, because people inherently are not good with highly repetitive, boring things. They're much better with individualized problems or creative things to work on. And that's just use computers where they're good and use people where they're good. That's just a good rule of thumb. And communication. This is something that's independent of really AI, but it's such a common problem that needs to be reiterated. Departments that don't communicate together duplicate work needlessly. I've seen this across multiple companies, that this is an issue where you do some work at the beginning of the process on a project, and then some downstream department doesn't know about the work you've done. And so they go and redo all that work themselves. And so you want to increase your communication from the downstream, and so that way that rework can be avoided. And that is everything. Are there any questions?
That was great, Sean. Thanks so much. I want to quickly go back to one of your slides where you talked about a centralized team to implement it and to have some change champions embedded from various departments.
Yeah.
My mind is right now is with org structure and design, because I'm currently helping a client who is rapidly growing, and we've been building out the org structure. That's where my mind is at now. Can you elaborate a bit more on how you've seen the centralized team work effectively with rolling out generative AI throughout an
Sure.
organization?
I'm going to give some advice that's a little bit maybe like counterintuitive, but I would say find the curmudgeons in the organization, because if you can get them bought in, curmudgeons seem grumpy and stuff like that, but what they really care about is doing things right. And so if you can get them involved in these solutions and get their buy-in, they're going to give you really good concerns. They're really going to give you feedback that's going to be actually risks that you should be considering. And so I know that, but that would be where I would start, because they're going to be actually the people that are vested in it. They want to do a good job. And that's the kind of people you want actually giving feedback for the team.
Hey, Sean, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
At just point your sort of general feelings on something that's holding me back. I have a project where I'm trying to help a company that's a screw manufacturer, fastener manufacturer, automate their CAD drawing production.
Okay.
And I've used LLMs now, and we can automatically, we've fed them rules about part number structure and all that kind of stuff. And I can give them a description, a rough description of the screw, and it assigns a part number and gives it all these parameters. And now I'm setting up a table system where I can feed those parameters into a table-driven SolidWorks CAD drawing structure to automate the CAD drawing process. I'm finding it fairly laborious to go through all the different types of screws and all that sort of stuff
Yeah.
and feeding it to SolidWorks and all that. And I just wonder, I wonder if there's a lot going on because AI and LLMs are changing so fast. I don't know how much work I should put into doing this
Yeah.
because maybe I'll just be able to feed an LLM a description of a screw and it'll come back with a drawing for me and not even need to
Yeah.
use
Yeah.
SolidWorks or anything like that. How much of our lack of actual, those percentages you showed early on of successful AI implementation
Yeah.
in business, how much of that is just tied to people just not really wanting to engage because it's moving too fast?
There's certainly that risk. There's also a very large resistance to this might take my job away, and so then that also prevents engagement. With respect to the LLMs changing, that is, yeah, it's every week you're seeing in the news that like there's some new model that beat the previous models and stuff like that. And some of that you should take with a grain of salt because they're all like gamifying against metrics. And so yeah, you can optimize towards metrics, but then you might suck at everything else. And I think there was this, I can't remember if it was Facebook's recent one or if it was OpenAI, but they recently released something that was like it was so bad that they like had to back it out. But it did really well on metrics. So like that's the danger with any of these things. In terms of investing time, the way I like to think of this is, and this is a general good software architecture approach anyway, you identify the areas that are likely to change and you build like an interface adapter so that everything from your system beyond that will not have to change. And then you just hook it into something new. For example, like with Olama, if you were say like self-hosting the LLM, you could download 20 different LLMs and then you could change which one is providing you the answers on the fly. So, and you could make it so that your system's independent of the actual LLM at play. However, that said, there are tricks that you can get better performance with certain LLMs certain ways. So there are ways to optimize just for one particular LLM. With respect to the problem you mentioned with all those screws, it might be useful to either use a cache augmented generation or a retrieval augmented generation setup where you provide technical specs in a formulated or in your documents to the LLM, and then it can actually be more intelligent.
Yeah, and what I've been doing so far is having to pull together all the specs that are required for each different type of screw. But what I'd love to do is ask the LLM to just reference ISO 2764 or whatever. The problem I have there is that I'm getting crap results back from the LLMs on any of those technical documents. I'm just
Are you using any that are search enabled or deep research enabled?
see, that's I don't know.
Okay.
I'm using DeepSeek, I'm using OpenAI, and
Yeah.
I get if I said what's the diameter of an M3 flathead screw per ISO blah 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 blah, I get 3 different answers depending on who I ask.
Well, for example, OpenAI has like a deep researcher where it would be much more. I actually use that for evaluating a number of CRMs. Like I was going through 20 different CRMs and narrowing it down and getting the pros and cons and stuff like that. And it would give you the original source documents. And so like that one, it will actually give constrained research-based answers as opposed to just whatever its statistical probabilities are.
Got it. Okay, so concentrate on the.
It's going to be more expensive. That's the warning. It'll be more expensive.
Yeah.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Dan Koser Consulting and Engineering. We have a lot of clients that want to, manufacturing clients that want to adapt artificial intelligence, and many of them, though, are in the aerospace industry. So you've got ITAR and CMMC, and and the cybersecurity is a holdback for them. They want to figure that out before they venture forward with doing some practical applications. So what's your advice on how to appease them and set something up without and keeping the security of their very confidential data? The government data too.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a very important consideration. And so I know, for example, Azure provides something that's ITAR compliant. And so you can do OpenAI queries through Azure, Microsoft's Azure. But like personally, I prefer, if you're willing to invest in hosting a server on site, I would recommend doing a local LLM because nothing goes over the wire. And I would also avoid the ones that are from China just as a safety precaution, but nothing goes over the wire and it's all within your intranet. And then there's no risk of some organization training off of your data. There's no risk of it going out of a constrained, safe environment. And that would generally be what I'm typically much more open to non-cloud solutions than most of my colleagues are. So I actually prefer non-cloud solutions.
Yeah, we were actually considering putting in a Linux server just to isolate it from everything.
And there's some really nice performance improvements that using Linux instead of, say, Windows will happen with those self-hosted LLMs. I was just watching something where this guy was getting like 50% performance improvement over using a Linux.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Sean, I had a quick suggestion. Is it okay if I piggyback on your answer?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Dan, my name is Rahul Kaul. I'm the CEO of Ardor Digital. We are one of the partners of Fresh Consulting. This question that you asked about the cybersecurity in the manufacturing is of utmost importance. And having it in an in-house environment is honestly an ideal solution. But we got to be cognizant of the fact that having to manage anything in-house totally needs supporting staff who's qualified to maintain it, upgrade it, and also keep on making sure that the threats, which are imminent every day, new threats coming out, somebody is knowledgeable enough to basically protect your organization from your own hosted environment. Very good solution, but we got to know that it takes an army of different skill sets to make sure that it is safe. We are an MSP, managed services provider in the technology business, and wherein we work with Fresh Consulting on the AI implementation in industries across, including manufacturing. As a matter of fact, I started as a mechanical engineer. So your question is absolutely valid. And the way to look at it is two facets: that planning for the resources needed to make sure that it is working fine and is secured, number one. Number two, there's another option of a hybrid cloud, which basically mimics your environment, which is locally hosted, into a private cloud, which is not like going the data out to the China or the other countries. So those are, I would say, a couple of insights I could add to that question.
And that's a great addition, because one of the reasons that companies moved towards the cloud was the staffing costs. And so what Raul brings up is an important consideration to my advice. My advice was like just hand waving that away, but that's a really important thing to consider when you're thinking about self-hosting.
I used to work with large manufacturing companies like Samsung and watch manufacturing company back in India in those old days. Now things have changed. I completely understand the importance of having and protecting your intellectual property of designs and documents and processes which are unique to any manufacturing facility, making them leaders in their own position. Please consider resource requirement as well as an option of hybrid cloud. Yeah. If you have more questions, I'm happy to work with Sean, provide that after this call.
That's great. We are at the top of the hour, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Sean, thank you so much for joining us and speaking to the CAMPS community.